All right, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And Paul, we are in the middle we're kind of wrapping up this episode.
Yeah.
A short series that we're doing on the world after the flood. So in our very first episode, 2 episodes ago, we looked at the actual mechanism of the flood, the tectonic event that was the flood, and all of the implications that has for the world as it recovered. So we talked about warm oceans that drove a lot of rainfall and produced the Ice Age, a lot of inland lakes, which led to canyon carving. We talked about the tectonics, the exploding volcanoes, and the earthquakes, and all that stuff. So lots of stuff happening in the post-flood period, more than just, for example, Noah getting off the ark and finding a nice flat, dry place to live. It's just a really devastated landscape that continued to be pretty devastated then. And we call that residual catastrophism. Last episode, we talked through my work on created kinds, where basically we tried to make a small number of assumptions about the created kinds and how they work. And we ended up with this idea about camels diverging or branching off or breaking off from their camel llama ancestral population that got on the ark and off the ark. And that happened in a very short amount of time because we have very old art that shows camels in that region, dromedary camels. And we have very early biblical references to dromedary camels. So we can kind of pin down, using biblical chronology, we can sort of pin down when these things were known and first reported. And that gives us a pretty tight framework to produce them. And so we argued that's not an evolutionary pattern. Evolution is too random, it's too slow. It's not going to produce the kind of changes that we actually observe in the created kinds after they got off the ark. Yeah, so those are our last 2 episodes. We're on to the final episode now. Anything that I missed, anything that we should add to that recap there?
Well, I think we should just remind our viewers and listeners that these episodes are overviews. We haven't given lots of details, about any of the claims that we're making. We're just kind of throwing things out there because we're trying to give an overview. We're not getting into all of the scientific detail. We probably, we could, and we probably should do that in future episodes. We could spend dozens of episodes, couldn't we, on the topics that we've been talking about in these 3 episodes. So, yeah, that would keep us busy. We'd have another 5 years of episodes or something.
Probably.
we could do that. So anyway, so if you're kind of about to make a comment and say they didn't give any evidence, for any of this stuff, well, we know because we are just trying to give this big picture, broad brushstrokes.
Right.
We're not filling in all the details, but bear with us. We'll get there. We'll come back to all of these topics at some point and fill in more of the details. Yeah. So what's today's topic then, Todd? What are we going to talk about in this episode?
Yeah. So you'll remember this series was generously supported by a donor who wanted us to talk about the recovery of the world after the flood. I hope this fills in what he wanted. It's been a lot of fun doing this series. But one of the things he definitely mentioned was how do you get animals from the ark to where they live, right? Yep. So that is our topic of the day, is essentially what we would call post-flood dispersal. That's sort of the kind of a technical name for the question that he's asking. How do you get all the creatures to where we currently find them?
Yeah, and this has been one of those long-standing criticisms, hasn't it, of the young Earth creationist viewpoint. So skeptics will point to animals like sloths, and they'll say, look, these animals are vulnerable animals. They're very slow-moving animals. How could sloths have traveled from the Middle East, where the ark presumably landed, to their present home, which is the jungles of South America? They don't travel very well. I mean, they're slow-moving animals. They have a low metabolism. They don't sprint around anywhere. So how did How did they do this? And they're not adapted. They're adapted to jungle life, so they've got to pass through all of these other environments, all of these other habitats to get there to South America. They've got to go through the Siberian Arctic or the American deserts or something like that. So how did that happen? And then thirdly, how did this happen without them leaving any trace of their migratory route? Why are they today only found there in Central and South America, and we don't find them in other places? So this is the kind of thing that the skeptics say, and of course sloths are just one example. There are lots of other examples. If you really want to sort of wind up the skeptics and let them go, we could talk about marsupials in Australia, which have a very strange distribution. So anyway, so this is kind of this is the question, and I guess in this episode, Todd, you're going to answer all of these questions for us. You're going to kind of give us the slam dunk answers. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're here for. We're gonna try to do an overview as you've already so correctly mentioned. We're gonna try to draw on what the Bible tells us about the world after the flood, and we're gonna try to draw on the science of biogeography, which is about where species are and how they came to live where they live. And that's going to give us a framework for understanding specific questions like sloths or marsupials, right? And yes, we're not going to be able to answer everything, but it'll be fun. So let's start off, before we kind of get into this question of how did sloths get to where they live, let's acknowledge here there's a bit of ambiguity about the landing place of Noah's Ark. I don't think we've talked about this. I was trying to remember if we ever touched on this in previous episodes. There's been so many episodes now, it's getting hard to remember specific topic like that. But the Bible only mentions the mountains of Ararat. The ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. We know Ararat is the mountainous region of Urartu, which covers about 90,000 square miles in the modern countries of essentially Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Syria, that area there. That's Urartu. It's about the size of Great Britain, which for those of us who did not grow up in the British Isles and do not know the precise terms, that is the landmass that contains Scotland, England, and Wales. That's properly understood as Great Britain.
Yes, indeed.
So I got that right? Good.
You did.
Because I did not grow up understanding the geography of the British Isles. But anyway. So Urartu's this really very large region, and it's fairly mountainous in parts of it. Now, today, a lot of people associate Mount Ararat with what is known as Agrada, or Greater Ararat. That is understood to be the landing place of the ark. But the geology there indicates that mountain is a post-flood volcano, which we would associate with sort of the post-flood volcanism that happened after the flood. And so there's kind of a question of whether that volcano would even exist prior to the flood or during the flood. But as I said, Urartu is a mountainous region. There are other places, and there have historically been other sites that have been promoted as being the landing place of the ark. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. That's an interesting one. Maybe we'll do an episode on that at some time in the future, because that does sound very interesting. Yeah, we'll write that down. But we're just going to say Ararat is that region there, that Urartu region, and we'll just go from there. It's small enough on the global scale that we can get away with that. So, Paul, your question was sloths. And I think that's a really interesting question. Because I think you already know the first answer that any creationist biologist would give to that question. How could sloths possibly crawl their way from the ark in Ararat to Central and South America? And the answer is they didn't. They did not do that. Right. And why do we think that?
Well, because it's based on a false assumption about what creationists think about the history of species, which we kind of touched on last time. So the kind of anti-creationist sort of caricature, I suppose, of our position is that we reject anything that smacks of evolution.
Yes.
And that must mean that we believe that God made all of the species exactly as they exist today, in exactly the places that we find them today. As an aside, I remember being once at a meeting where I was probably one of the few creationists, maybe the only creationist present. And over the dinner table, I heard somebody next to me say that creationists believe in that species don't change. And I kind of tried to correct them and said, well, look, I'm a creationist and that isn't my position. And he looked at me with complete bafflement and said, well, that must mean you're not really a creationist. So, anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That must be it.
The thought that went through my head is don't tell my employer because they're kind of employing me because they think I am. So,
right. Yeah.
Okay. So, so that's kind of the anti-creationist sort of caricature, right? So the species have never changed at all. So there were 2 of every species of air-breathing land animal on the ark. And so there must have been 6 pairs of sloths, right?
Yeah.
1 pair for each of the 6 species of sloth that we have, and that they were on the ark. They came off the ark at the end of the flood. They migrated somehow together across Asia, through North America down into Central and South America. And there that all 6, ancestral sloth species decide to settle and make a living there together down in South and Central America. And I suppose if you kind of frame it like that, then yes, it sounds very, very implausible, right? So, but we don't think that. That's not what creationists think. So, as we saw in the last episode, creationists for a very long time have been skeptical of the absolute fixity of species, even before the time of Darwin. And we noted in the last episode that creationists today believe that the modern species that we see descended from generalized ancestors that were on the ark. So there was a single created kind represented on the ark that gave rise to modern species, which are more highly adapted. That's why they seem very often to be so vulnerable, fragile, immovable, if you like the sloth. That's one of the reasons, in fact, why we think modern species can't possibly be the animals that were present on the ark. Modern species have changed. They've adapted. They have become adapted to the particular environments where we find them today. But they were descended from more generalized ancestors that came off the ark. So this kind of caricature, it's just sort of founded on this very unrealistic assumption about what creationists must believe that isn't true.
Yeah. You must not be a creationist then.
I must not be a creationist.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Anyway, and you're right. That argument is pretty much everywhere. I hear about it. I read about it all the time. Creationists supposedly believe that God made all the species exactly as we find them, in the last 10,000 years or whatever. And it's just a straw man. It's an easy foil if you're trying to argue for evolution, right? Oh, well, creationists must think that God made everything individually, but look at evolution explains all this other data. Yeah, but it's obviously a ridiculous position. It can't possibly be right. Sloths being one reason. There are many other sorts of species just like that, where they have a very limited range, and yet they seem to be quite fragile, and how could they possibly get here? Yeah, because the ancestors must be much more robust. So I look at the sloths and I think, wow, the ancestral sloth must have been super sloth, right? Super active and super robust and super able to manage through different environments. He could not possibly be these lazy things that can barely cross a road. Most sloths I encounter now come on social media, and they're just videos of people helping them across the road.
That's right. Yeah.
To tourists usually, yeah. So that's the first point that I think is really valuable to make in this whole episode here, is that when we're thinking about animals dispersing to their current locations, we're not talking about the species dispersing there. We're talking about potentially very different sorts of ancestors that had different characteristics. And so this whole argument of fragile species that can't go and can't move, it's all just a red herring. It's all just a diversion. It's a straw man that doesn't really have anything to do with what we really think. We're not talking about, carrying fragile species across thousands of miles to get them to their current location. That's not our position.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question, I guess, is what exactly we're trying to explain. What are the distributions of species and created kinds around the world? I mean, we've got to be clear about that, haven't we? If this is what we're trying to understand. And so we don't want to get too hung up on sort of specific questions. How did sloths get to South America? Because although that's interesting, it's only one problem among hundreds of other, potential sort of examples. And so we don't want to get hung up on just one sort of instance. We want to look at how many species distributions we can readily explain within the creation model. And I know, Todd, you've done quite a bit of research already on these kinds of questions. So perhaps you could talk us through some of the work that you've done, specifically looking at mammals.
Yeah. So I looked into this quite a number of years ago because I was just sort of curious about sort of the scope of what I think of as speciation at the time. This whole idea of diversity within created kinds. So I looked at terrestrial mammal families. I looked at different, as we know, different experts have different opinions. So I looked at 3 different sets of delineations of mammals specifically. Now I wanted to look at only terrestrial mammals and only specifically stable terrestrial mammals. So I excluded seals, sea lions, and walruses. I excluded the manatees, and I excluded the whales. And I also excluded hominids, mostly because I know from my research that there's probably more than one created kind within the hominids. By that, modern biologists classify the great apes, chimpanzee, gorilla, and orangutan together with human beings in family Hominidae. I'm not saying there are multiple created kinds of people. I'm talking about the modern biological notion there's apes belong to the same family as we do. It's a completely different concept, so don't freak out. All right, so terrestrial mammals other than the hominids and other than these seals, sea lions, walruses, and so forth. Okay. Now I found there are only a few hundred mammal families. And again, depends on who's counting. And the numbers weren't that very different. The majority of the families have less than 10 species. And I think that's very important when we think about, how do you produce all these species in such a short amount of time? Well, on the larger scale of mammals, terrestrial mammals, we're not. Most of them aren't producing that many species at all. There's a few that go crazy and produce a lot of species, but most of them don't. Most of them have very few species. So that's very interesting. Again, something that's not very like evolution. Now, counting the ones, back to the number of families. So if we count the things that we see in the fossil record as well, there's about roughly 350 families of mammals that we think are a proxy for the created kind. That's approximately what the created kind would be. Now, of those, about 150 have no species or even fossils found in either continental Asia, Africa, or Europe, which means that there's 200 that do have species or fossil remains that are found in either Europe, Africa, or Asia. So right off the bat, we see that the majority of mammal kinds, about 57%, are consistent with the dispersal from Ararat, right? The idea that they just walk to where they live now, that makes sense because there's remains of them there in Asia, Africa, or Europe where they could have walked. Okay, so what about the 150 families where they don't? Okay, these are found, 100 of them are found on continental North or South America, but not anywhere in, as I said, Europe, Africa, or Asia. Now, for those, we only have to imagine then how they got to the Americas, right? It's not a lot of different patterns that we have to explain, just how you get to the Americas. And I would imagine that it's probably a similar route for most of them. Then that leaves us with 50 mammal families. There are only 15 that are found exclusively on Australia or Papua New Guinea, which we'll talk about could be considered as part of the same landmass. And then there are only 10 left that have no trace in the Americas, Eurasia, Africa, or Australia and Papua New Guinea. 6 of those are found on Madagascar, which is a really interesting place and a very strange story. 3 of them are found in Caribbean islands, and 1 is found in New Zealand. Now, the 6 on Madagascar, they're all primates, mostly lemurs. So that's an interesting story, and we definitely need to do a Madagascar episode, because Madagascar is fascinating. Not just because of the silly cartoon movies, but because it is actually a fascinating place. Madagascar is amazing. So 6 of them are primates on Madagascar, okay? Now, the one on New Zealand is a bat. That's a bat family. And you could imagine, and this might seem hard to imagine, but you could imagine that bats got blown there during a storm. So that's maybe not so implausible that you could get bats to New Zealand. The 3 in the Caribbean are interesting. One of them is called the Capromyids. They're a group of rodents, specifically, that are thought to be closely related to another group of rodents in South America. So they actually might not be a separate created kind. They might be part of that other created kind that's found in South America. So that might not be hard to explain. The other 2, found only in Caribbean, might actually be a single kind as well. They are the Solenodons of Cuba and Hispaniola, and then something called Nisophantes, which are found throughout the Caribbean. They're all just little shrew-like insectivore creatures, and tests indicate that they're most similar to each other, but not very similar to other things. So it could be that there's one single created kind that lives there in that region. So as we think about mammal families, we have only a few places that end up isolated in really weird places. And most of them have a distribution that's pretty consistent with spreading out from Ararat, walking to places in Eurasia or Africa. And that makes a lot of sense. So then I guess the main question that we ought to think about then is, how did, say, more than 100 mammal kinds travel from Ararat to the Americas? So I'm going to throw that back over to you, Paul. Do you have an explanation for how that might happen?
Well, I mean, I can give you one possibility. It's an explanation that's been around for quite a long time. And then, yeah, I'll throw it out there, and then you can tell me how it's all far more complicated than that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So if we kind of go back to the 16th century, that great age of exploration, we had early European explorers and colonists, many of them Christian, or at least nominally Christian, and they were sort of thinking about what they were seeing in their explorations from a Christian worldview. And one of these explorers was a Jesuit priest called Father Jose de Acosta. He explored South America, and he was looking at all of these strange animals living there in South America and wondering how did they come to live there. He considered various possibilities. He didn't think it was likely that people brought them with them, partly because a lot of them weren't domesticated or weren't useful to people. So he thought that was unlikely. He also thought it was unlikely that they could have swum across the ocean because that was a very difficult trip. I mean, even if you were in a boat. So he didn't think they were swimming across the ocean. So he basically wondered if somewhere there might be a kind of corridor of land connected the Americas to Europe and Asia, to Eurasia. And in fact, he's one of the first people to remember today anticipating the idea of some kind of land bridge connection. You'll remember in the first episode of this series, we talked about the Ice Age. We said that after the flood, there were huge ice sheets covering large areas of North America and Europe. And one of the consequences of an ice age with all of that water locked up in ice sheets is that you lower sea level. So sea level would have been lower than today during the time of glaciation. And when the glaciers were at their maximum extent, the current seafloor between Alaska and Siberia would essentially have been dry land. It would have been exposed above sea level. And scientists have actually called this strip of land that presumably existed during the Ice Age, they've called it Beringia, after the Bering Straits. So, in principle at least, you could imagine animals from Eurasia essentially walking into the Americas across that land bridge, walking on dry land, and eventually spreading from North America down into South America. There are a couple of problems with this scenario. One is that the glaciers that cause the sea level to drop and expose this land corridor covered most of Canada, as we said in our first episode. And that would have presented quite a barrier to animals walking down through North America. It's difficult to envisage them walking long distances across an ice sheet.
Right.
So that's one problem. The second problem is perhaps a bit more complex, which is that because it depends on dating, and as creationists, of course,
it's very sensitive.
We're very sensitive about dating, and we want to sort of reevaluate conventional dates and all of that. But if the dates are at least relatively accurate, even if they're not absolutely giving us absolute dates, right?
Yes,
but if they give us at least a relative chronology, then it looks as if there were animals already well established in the Americas when the glacial maximum happened, when that land bridge was exposed. So presumably they had to get there before that point, before the land bridge was there. So it seems at first a kind of attractive solution, but there are some complications, right?
Yeah.
So, so maybe it's not quite as attractive a solution as we imagine.
Right.
I mean, do we have any other ideas? Have I missed anything?
Well, possibly. So here we kind of need to think more broadly again about biogeography. So remember, in this series, this is all about the big picture. So the big picture of biogeography here. So when we look, say, within, say, a created kind, sometimes we'll find what we call a disjunction or a disjunct distribution, where different parts of the created kind are separated by some kind of barrier to dispersal, usually an ocean. And these disjunctions are weirdly common. So we've already mentioned camel llamas, right? Rama the Kama being the hybrid and camel llama being the ancestral creature on the ark. Well, camels and dromedaries and Bactrian camels are native to Asia, Central Asia, whereas the llamas, the guanaco, the vicuña, and the llama, they are native to the Americas, South America. So that's an example of a disjunction where you have these closely related species that are presumably the same created kind, but they're separated on completely different continents. This is, it doesn't really matter if you call it a created kind or you call it a mammal family or whatever. This is common enough that it's noted by biogeographers trying to explain how things came to be where they were. And conventional scientists at one point were trying to use these disjunct species to argue for plate tectonics. So their idea was that at one point there was, when the continents were joined together, there was, one species of whatever it was, camel llama, and then the continents broke apart, and then the camel and llama became separated. Great. But as evolutionary biologists have continued to sort of explore those ideas, we've become kind of disillusioned. Because most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, a lot of the time, these disjunctions are the wrong age. So the breakup of North and South of the Americas from the Old World, that's happening, well within the Mesozoic, and the breaking up of the sea there is happening well within the Mesozoic. So more than 100 million years ago on the conventional time scale. And yet camels and llamas, they appear to have diverged about 35 million years ago, which is well after there was an ocean separating the two places. So, that's a problem. So, so how does that work then? How do you get things across the ocean? And the answer is you just do, right? So, so evolutionary biologists, they call these sweepstakes routes or sweepstakes. And basically their idea is they're just depending on millions of years to do the work for them. So it might be hard for us to imagine how a llama could cross an ocean in the modern world and we could see it. We might give that a chance of 1 in a million. But if you have, 20 million years and your chances are 1 in a million, then it could happen 20 times, right? Because you got 20 million years. So given enough time, low probability events become not just probable, but impossible to not happen. And so the evolutionary biologist calls these sweepstakes routes because it seems like you won the sweepstakes. Hey, I won the lottery or whatever. Now, when a creationist looks at this, I think we have a kind of advantage over the evolutionist here because I think we have to think more carefully about the debris that would be floating in the water after the flood. So remember here Spirit Lake, right? We've talked about Spirit Lake a lot. The Mount St. Helens is this marvelous little laboratory of places to go and make really interesting observations about catastrophe and recovery. Spirit Lake, as we said, it's north of the mountain. The mountain blew laterally to the north, which is kind of a weird thing. But that lateral explosion sort of leveled the forest there to the north. And the logs were washed into Spirit Lake. And 45 years after the eruption, you can still see the logs floating there. And that's just one, on the global scale of things, that's one tiny eruption in one tiny location in a relatively small forest area. So now try to imagine then the whole world's forests being ripped up at once and thrown into the ocean. So the mats of debris must have been just enormous and possibly quite stable. So in the flood scenario, there might be a way for animals to actually readily cross an ocean on these large, stable, floating debris mats. And this was not, I'm not making this stuff up. This was proposed by some researchers at the ICC, the International Conference on Creationism, in 2003. But I think it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to me that you would have a lot of vegetation that would, if we have, logs floating in Spirit Lake still, you would have a lot of logs floating in the ocean, a lot of vegetation and debris floating in the ocean after the flood. Those debris mats that come close to the land, that's going to be where plant recovery is going to start. So that makes sense to me. That's going to draw in the herbivores, which are going to draw in the carnivores, who actually have a mechanism to make it even more probable that something could end up actually, on one of these mats when a storm comes along and blows part of it out to sea and maybe sends them all the way across an ocean. So the sweepstakes route of the evolutionist actually becomes, I think, even more probable under, just a basic, simple assumption about what the oceans might have been like after the flood.
Yeah, it's a wild idea, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I think we need to talk about it some more in a future episode, because I think it's a really exciting idea. It explains a lot of things, actually.
It does.
We maybe need to do, dare I say it, another whole series on biogeography. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. But for this episode, we're given the overview, right?
Right.
And we've only got a few more minutes left. So there's one more big topic that I just want to sort of raise at this point, and that's concerning islands. Now, technically, to a biogeographer, an island is any small habitat that's surrounded by a barrier to dispersal. So an island doesn't necessarily have to be surrounded by water.
Right.
An island could be a butte in the middle of Grand Canyon, or a mountain or something. But let's think about islands that are surrounded by water, okay, for our purposes here. So there are two kinds of islands that you might think about. There are continental islands. These are islands that are basically made of the same stuff as the continents. They're made of the same kind of rocks.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually fairly close to a continent.
Mm-hmm.
They may, in the past, have had a history of being connected to the continent.
Yeah.
So actually sort of envisaging how animals get to continental islands is not too difficult because of that close connection. So what kinds of, let's think of some examples. We've mentioned the British Isles. Well, no, we mentioned Britain, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
Which
Great
is slightly
Britain. Yes, slightly
Great
different.
Britain, which is different to the British Isles. Anyway, that's a digression. Yeah, so the British Isles, continental island. Okay, we're part of the European continent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but we're an island surrounded by water. Sicily, Crete, Cyprus. These are all continental islands. Madagascar, that you mentioned earlier, off the east coast of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
That's continental island. There are others in Asia, Indonesia, Japan, the Philippines. Okay, these are all continental islands. They're part of the continental mass. They're usually separated from the main continent by a relatively shallow, often narrow stretch of water. Britain is separated from the mainland of Europe by the English Channel. So it's really not very hard to see how animals cross those barriers. They're not really insuperable barriers at all. But there are other kinds of islands which are sort of oceanic islands, often volcanic in origin. So you can imagine a volcano erupting on the floor of the ocean, and as that volcano builds up, eventually the volcano is exposed above sea level and forms a new island.
Mm-hmm.
These islands, sometimes they'll disappear, they'll sink, they'll subside, but if they persist, you can get a substantial island building up. Hawaii would be an example. So these are basaltic volcanoes on the ocean floor where the ocean crust is moving over a hotspot in the Earth's mantle, and it's forming this series of islands, this chain of volcanic islands. Some, like Hawaii, are relatively old, geologically speaking. Some of these oceanic islands are quite young, like Surtsey, which was an island that appeared off the coast of Iceland in the 1960s. So relatively recent. And also oceanic islands can be much further from any nearby continental mass than continental islands. So Hawaii is quite isolated. Reunion Island in the Atlantic, Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. These are more sort of remote spots. So the question is, as we think about islands, and particularly oceanic islands, how do we explain as creationists how animals got to those islands, remote islands, far from the mainland? Have you got some thoughts on that, Todd?
Yeah, so I would say, to start, we've already kind of given a basic framework to help explain the inhabitants of these islands, and that is this notion of post-flood debris rafting stuff, right? So you've got all the mess in the water. Animals accidentally get out on there, and then they get washed out to sea, and they follow the currents to wherever they're going. Now, what makes oceanic islands interesting, I think, is that some of them obviously are originating later after the flood than others. So when we look at the debris in Spirit Lake, we notice that certain species of trees with different densities of wood are going to get waterlogged and sink faster than others, right? So that you have, as time goes by, a sort of the debris there becomes less, and it becomes, I would say, less stable as you lose certain parts of it, right? And so thinking then about the debris that's happening after the flood, you're going to have the same pattern. You're going to have, as time goes by, there's going to be maybe a fairly steep drop-off in stability of those rafts. So what was once very large and stable and maybe suitable for moving mammals from continent to continent becomes, maybe within a century or two, extremely unstable and not suitable for transporting mammals at all, and maybe only able to move things that are what we might call naturally raftable. So Galapagos is a great example. I wrote a book on Galapagos. There's lots of really interesting native creatures there. Most of the natives of Galapagos are reptiles, birds, or insects. These are all animals that are naturally raftable. Even the birds, of course, could have just been blown there by storms. The reptiles could have rafted under their own power, but, put them on a log mat and they'd probably get there much more readily. As far as the mammals go, there is a native rice rat and a seal. Now, the seal, you can imagine, got there possibly under its own power. The rice rat, try to keep rats out of anything, right? Rats are extremely successful creatures. They're going to get everywhere. And so to find a native rat in Galapagos doesn't surprise me in the least. They're all, so even the mammal that we find there, they're all very raftable creatures. And so even the Galapagos tortoise, the giant tortoise, there's another giant tortoise that lives in the Indian Ocean on islands there. And we have one historical documented instance in the modern period. I heard about this a number of years ago, where one of those giant tortoises just ended up on the beach in Eastern Africa. And people were kind of surprised to see him. He didn't look very good. He looked like he'd had a hard go of it. But yeah, he'd naturally washed through the ocean to Africa. So if you add this notion of debris rafts that may be less stable, not stable enough to carry mammals, you can imagine a way to get animals quite far into the ocean following currents with these naturally raftable creatures. So for me, the islands that you talk about, the oceanic islands specifically, it's not hard to imagine how they could have gotten there, given the fact that they are the weird sort of animals that they are. They're birds, they're reptiles, they're things that move readily on these debris mats, or even readily just on their own power.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and you're right about rats. They get absolutely everywhere. They chewed up my library, some of my library.
They're the worst.
They can get everywhere. Yeah, so it seems, what we're saying in this episode is there's an awful lot of biogeography that is actually quite consistent with the basic claims of creationism. Because that isn't the impression that you kind of have immediately. Biogeography is seen as this enormous problem for creationists.
Yes.
And a big sort of powerful evidence for evolutionary theory. I suppose the one thing we didn't really get into the detail of is Madagascar and Australia.
Right.
And they're kind of,
they're weird.
They're weird.
Yep.
And they're big topics, and maybe we're going to have to talk about those separately. You mentioned having an episode on Madagascar. Maybe we could do one on Australia. Maybe even get an Australian creationist to come and talk to us
there
about.
You go. I think we know a few of
Biogeography.
them. We could probably get one. We could probably twist some arms and get somebody on here.
Yeah, I'm sure. So, but leaving aside those sort of details, and they are weird. There are some weird cases that we do need to think about. We can't ignore those. But on the other hand, kind of the broad brushstroke sort of picture seems fairly well explained within the creation model, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. You listen to, like you said, the skeptic. I got you. How are you going to get sloths from the ark? And it just becomes this much less threatening, much less dangerous thing that just doesn't seem all that frightening once you actually consider it. The vast majority of these things seem to be pretty readily explainable with basic biogeography that's maybe juiced up a little bit by what's happening with the flood. Maybe it's not as bad as people think. Yeah, but I don't see anything here that's utterly irresolvable. I think the framework that we have is going to give us pretty clear answers. And maybe, as you say, Madagascar and Australia are going to turn out to be weird, bit of a head scratcher. But that's happening. That kind of thing happens in conventional science too. But the big picture that we've covered here is pretty consistent with dispersal of animals from Ararat. And that's that. That's our series. Yeah. That's our 3-part series on sort of the big picture. As we said, we're sort of giving you sort of the bird's eye view. We're going to have to come back and talk about a lot of the details. And I'm sure there are lots of people who are thinking, but what about? And yep, those are all great questions. You should tell us what your questions are. Maybe we can turn those into future episodes. And we definitely want to thank again our anonymous contributor who gave us this idea. You should do an overview of the world after the flood, which frankly was an idea that was, I think, bouncing around in our heads, but it hadn't got on the short list. So thank you very much. And I hope we delivered. I hope that this episode has been, I hope you've been happy with what we've done. I think we've had a good time doing it. Yeah, definitely want to plan out some future episodes because there's a lot of questions. But I'm really excited, and I think biogeography is just one of the most fascinating aspects of creationism. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks for watching. Do like this video. Subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you're listening to one of our podcast platforms, don't forget to subscribe, or maybe even leave us a review. Share our episodes with your friends on social media. Like us and follow us on social media. That helps too. Any little thing that you can do, those are really small things, but they really do help us out in the long term. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the series, and we will see you in 2 weeks with a totally new subject and a totally new topic of conversation.
Yeah, we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.